why don't we just go ahead and get started? Because we're here, you're here, and I think as people come, they will get right into the fold, and we don't want to waste a single second of our time with you. So thank you for building this community, being with us. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here in solidarity with us, and we're so grateful.
That's right. All right, so let's do it. Our session is called How to Identify White Supremacy and Anti-Black Racism in the U.S. History Curriculum, presented by myself, Chris Seeger, and my partner, the Raekwon to my ghost face, the, the Greg Nice to my smooth B. Okay, her name is Tiffany Mitchell Patterson, and she's a legend in the DC area educator world. We're so happy to have her with us.
Well, with an introduction like that, we are so excited to be in this work with you. In my daytime job, I'm a manager of social studies in DC public schools. And I'll toss it to Chris.
I'm currently teaching high school social studies in Binghamton, New York. I saw some folks joining us from New York, so glad to have you here as well. I've also taught in the DC area.
And we do have our roots in, as Virginia students, we grew up in Virginia. I grew up in the Hampton Roads area, Hampton 757, Chris repping at Nova, Northern Virginia, and we were teachers in Virginia. And so a lot of this work is really rooted in our experiences as both students and teachers.
It's true. And so what we're going to be talking about today is based on some research that we've been doing over the past couple of years, which culminated in a publication that came out a few months ago in the journal Curriculum Inquiry. This is the fruit of our labor. We were so happy for this to finally come out. And there is a great summary of this article hosted by Teaching for Change that you can find on their website. And it's probably in the mix with the resources that are going to be available. We can put that in the chat if not. So
I got you. I just dropped it in the chat.
wow. Thanks, Tiff. All right. And so we're going to begin by we want to just sit with a quote from that article. We're going to cite ourselves here. It says, white supremacy and anti-Black racism are like two vine tendrils that twist into one inextricable rope. And so, in other words, we can't talk about one without the other. And oftentimes we find that people want to talk about racism as a mysterious force and something bad that happened to Black people without acknowledging the source of that racism being white supremacy. And so we're going to confront those topics head on today in our session. And so quickly, we just want to help operationalize these terms, set some definitions. When we talk about white supremacy, what do we mean? On one hand, it's beliefs and action, both beliefs and actions, that it can be a person can do things that are unknowingly reinforcing and upholding white supremacy, even if they don't think that they're doing that in their mind. Second piece is patriarchy. If we look back at history and in society today, it's white men that have historically had the most power and the ability to enforce and benefit from white supremacy. And we'll even see in the standards that that Black men appear more often than white women in Virginia standards, at least. So there's that layer of gender discrimination along with racism that we'll be looking at. White supremacy involves the control of social institutions like government, corporation, housing, etc. We're not just talking, about individual acts of racism. Bar is covering there. Oh, the last piece there is whiteness as property. And that's what we think this is the primary way that white supremacy is enforced. We can think going back to the early days of colonization of privatizing the land that people had been living on already for thousands of years, owning other people as property, to more modern day issues of private property white flight from the cities, suburban enclaves, gated communities, private schools, defunding public schools. All of these kinds of issues relate to whiteness as property. And pass it to Tiff.
And it's important that we really wanted to be specific, as we know that racism is pervasive and it impacts so many and all of us. We really wanted to look at the specific racism against Black people, and not just in the United States, but across the diaspora. We know that this is both individual, it's structural, and it's really rooted in this inability to see the dignity, the humanity of Black people in what is known as the afterlife of enslavement. So Black people were enslaved in chattel slavery, and they were deemed as property. How is that legacy persistent today? And there's so many ways that the racism impacts Black people. So we wanted to really dive deep into that specific type of racism, though we do acknowledge, and we'll talk a little bit about some of our other findings to dive deeper into.
All right, so our first research question was which people are included in the standards, right? This is a basic approach to this topic. Who is in the curriculum? And so we looked, oh, but before we even show the graph, right, we're playing Guess Who. We want you to guess first before we tell you. So Tiff, do you want to moderate this?
Okay, so in thinking about the Virginia U.S. History Standards, which white men do you think are referenced the most? If you can put it in the chat. Which white men in Virginia do you think are? Oh, TJ, G-Dubs, Abraham Lincoln. And guess what? You would be right. Solid honorable mentions with James Madison, with George Mason. They are also highly up there. You would be surprised in thinking about how, as people that are products of Virginia, we often saw it was the US history as told through all these white men from Virginia. So you're getting Virginia history so many times. What about white women? Which white women do you think are referenced the most? Martha Washington, Susan B. Anthony, maybe some first ladies, suffragettes. Let's see.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding. We often see women appear in the suffrage movement, and we see the classic names: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Yes. What about Black men? Yes, I saw you. We had a Douglas Wilder. But think now, who might be the most referenced, though, in Virginia U.S. History Standards? Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, MLK, Martin Luther King, maybe Nat Turner. You would be right with Frederick Douglass repeatedly mentioned. And what about Black women? Oh, I love that note that you said. And when people are mentioned sanitized, we're going to talk about that. But what about Black women? Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Sojourner Truth. And let's see.
So this one's this is the only Black woman that is mentioned more than once in the Virginia History Standards, with 2 references.
With 2 references. So quite interesting when we see who is actually named, and then we'll get to a bit the frequency of when they're named.
Yeah, so let's look at that. We dove into the standards and we started counting people every time it said a name, and sorted them first by racial groups. So we see here predominantly white people being discussed in the standards. Black people receive some references, as we're going to talk about, it's not done in a way that's humanizing and respecting the, you know, the lives of these people. But then all other groups are basically squeezed out. There's almost no representation in the standards. But when we add that layer of gender into this, we see that it is mostly white men. And that pattern of patriarchy continues with the representation of Black people as well, where Black men are represented as individuals much more often than Black women. If a teacher follows the Virginia history standards, or if a student, you know, has a teacher who's just following the standards for their whole education, they'll only hear Black women talked about 10 times compared to nearly 200 mentions of white men. So it's a very staggering, skewed representation.
And so we thought it was really important to look at and compare how individuals were represented versus how they were represented as a group. And we came up with some really interesting findings in which we see that white people were often referenced as individuals by and large, and that Black people were less individualized and more referenced as groups. And there's ways to think about them both in different ways, but we definitely see an overrepresentation of white individuals for every group.
Right. And so this pattern exists from state to state too. I know there's, for example, people here from New York. I've looked at the New York standards, and in those standards, Black people are represented more often as a group than as individuals. So this isn't just a Southern issue, a Virginia issue. This is a national issue about how we teach the, you know, U.S. history narrative. And with our second research question, we asked, how did the standards discuss race and racism? And that's where we wanted to get more into the qualitative aspect of what kind of language are they using? How are they telling these stories? Because that's where a lot of the subtle racism and sexism are occurring, is through these word choices and sentence structures. So we're going to begin with the tactics of white supremacy, and then we'll look at tactics of anti-Black racism. So the first tactic is avoiding accountability. We see our founding enslavers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. The problem being, of course, that these men are mentioned dozens of times and they're never identified as enslavers. The history curriculum talks about slavery, but these very obvious connections are never made. And so here we can see an actual example of how the standards use this strategy of avoiding accountability. It says discrimination against African Americans and minority groups continued after Reconstruction. Okay, if there's any English teachers out there, you'll see this sentence is written in the passive voice. There's no subject doing the discrimination. They just leave that part out and use the word discrimination as if it's just this thing that happened mysteriously and no one is held accountable. Here's another example. Racial segregation directed primarily against African Americans, but other groups were also kept segregated. So who was doing the directing? Who was keeping people segregated, right? Where we see that they're willing to identify the group that's being harmed by these policies and social practices, African Americans, but we're not seeing that other side identified. The people who were designing, enforcing, and benefiting from segregation. Strategy number two of two is playing the victim. And we see this all the time when the heat is on. Powerful white men, is something that often happens is they say, I'm the victim here. You all are being unfair to me. And this happens in the standards as well. Here's an example. Slave revolts in Virginia, led by Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, fed white Southerners fears about slave rebellions and led to harsh laws in the South against fugitive slaves. And so shout out to our friend Brittany Jones, who did some great research about this concept of fear and how it's portrayed in the standards. White people are the only group who are described as fearful throughout all of the historical narrative, right? Black people are never fearful of white enslavers. Native American people are never described as fearful of colonizers. It's only white Southerners, and we'll see another example here in World War II, that there was a fear that Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy. All right.
So we also want to take some time to talk about some of the tactics that we picked up on of anti-Black racism. And one of the first things that quickly emerged was this idea of messiahs. When we think about who was mentioned, it was Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass. So he was mentioned repeatedly. Ida B. Wells mentioned twice, or Martin Luther King Jr. But they mentioned them devoid or in absence of the networks, the organizations that they worked within and worked to establish. So it removed that people's history, it removed that organizing history by making it seem as these one person did something exceptional, and so we're going to celebrate them with that. Fabulous people, wonderful organizers, wonderful leaders, but that was a key piece that we saw. And what's missing when we get the Messiah? Something else that we saw was this illusion of inclusion, that what we like to call it. So we're going to take a look at a standard real quick. The student will demonstrate an understanding of the first permanent English settlement in America by identifying the impact of the arrival of Africans and English women. Well, one, we say arrival as if this was a leisurely trip. We could get with the semantics there, but also it makes a false assumption that they had similar experiences. And so without the word choices matter. And that's something that we kept coming to, how every word has prime real estate and what happens when it's not said there. And so we wanted to look at what it looks like when they're included. Another example of this, working through the court system and mass protests, Americans reshaped public opinion and secured the passage of civil rights. It's as if Americans said, yeah, you know what, we're going to do something. When we know that this is very much rooted in Black movement organizing, Black resistance, the long civil rights movement. So the use of Americans here is a very interesting choice because of who actually, let's give credit to where it's due, who actually led this. And another piece that we saw are these silos of victimhood. So to give you a quick example, when I was teaching middle school, I remember when my student said, Martin Luther King freed the slaves. And I was like, what? But what it was indicative of is when and where Black people entered the curriculum. So the student understood Black people are in slavery, and then Black people are in this latter civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Black histories tend to appear in very predictable units. Then it's almost as if they're not there. We don't talk about them. This also occurs with other ethnicities and other ethnic groups as well, when and how they enter the curriculum. So we saw that what is lost when our Black history is confined to units mostly tied to oppression, then there's usually this one, well, then we have jazz in the Harlem Renaissance. And so I think it's really important that we think about when those stories are told and how they appear.
That's right. One other thing to mention with this is that when we silo Black people's experiences into these units, it betrays students' understanding of how long the period of enslavement was, how long the Jim Crow era was, because they talk about Reconstruction and Jim Crow and then move on and say, oh, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, without acknowledging that that context was ongoing, which is problematic. Before we talk about the implications, and it's a little bit different when we do these events virtually to have the kind of back and forth with the audience, but I'm sure there's ideas swirling around in your heads right now. I know we've got a great group here. If you want to just jump in the mix and talk about any connections or anything that you're feeling and thinking about this so far, we would love to hear from the folks that are here with us.
So please share your thoughts in the chat if you have seen this for yourselves in your own curriculum. And we'll have a time for you to dive deeper into it as well. But we just want to see, are these some of the things you're seeing as well? So we'll take a minute or two for you to process that.
We are going to talk about the kind of timeline with the current Virginia standards in just a second.
We'll take, about 30 more seconds, drop in the chat, but we're going to have some time for you all to dive in because I think it's helpful for you to look at it and see. Civil War, yes. That's another silo of victimhood for sure. Yes, the timeline that racism ended, as if it's not an ongoing structural piece of our society. Token mentions of movements, right? And they usually jam them all together in one standard if we get them. Yeah, it becomes an issue of finding text. And I definitely want to shout out Social Justice Books here, which is a great resource to find those stories and add them to your classroom libraries, especially now when it's super politicized. Yeah, and what happens when so much of the history is rooted in enslavement, which is a significant part of our history, but it's not our only history. And how can we push for diverse Black histories to be told, even during the period of enslavement?
I think Liz brings up a great point there, and this is something I struggle with as a classroom teacher. Is we'll be reading a book or something, see a YouTube video about it, about a person or a movement, and you're like, I want to teach this, but it's hard to sometimes find all of the information and in a format that's ready to be used as a lesson plan. So a lot of times teachers are having to custom make these, and we don't have a lot of time to custom make lessons every single day. So yeah, that's definitely a struggle.
Yes, and I definitely want to highlight Zen Education Project and their resources as a really great help. But you're right, we need more. I would also highlight the BLM at School curriculum. Great resources in there that help to value Black humanity and really do some recentering work beyond the historical context. Yes. Shout out to the Reconstruction comment. It's my favorite period to study. And as you said, it is ongoing, never ending. So we're going to push forward because we want to make sure that we talk about the implications, but give you a chance to dive deeper into the standards.
Right. And so what we're going to see when people point out these kinds of shortcomings in the curriculum, the kind of go-to solution is often a diversity approach, that they just need to add some more people of color, add a few more women into the curriculum. And that's just not going to fix these issues. We need to reckon with white supremacy. We need to think about the whole narrative that we're telling, who is being given access to being humanized, to have the full experiences of life, not just those experiences of struggling for their rights and things like that. And as we develop new standards, new curriculum, new pedagogical practices, we need to do what that concept of decentering white supremacy and recentering historical historical narratives, decentering the master narratives, and recentering the diverse narratives, which you can still learn about all of the events. You don't have to focus on George Washington to learn about the American Revolution. And I look forward to a future where we can have curriculum that supports that approach.
So we began working on this project a couple years ago in 2020, and it was during the Northam administration. They had formed the African American History Educational Commission. There was all this movement and traction towards these standards. There was about starting a standard revision process. And then there was a change in leadership, as you all know, to the Youngkin administration, who signed an executive order on day one that was anti-CRT, or like we like to talk about it here as anti-history. So we know that the standards that we are looking at and talking about have just been really politicized and gone through a lot of changes and discussion. So there was an August draft put forth last year, in August of 2020, that was a collaborative effort, thousands of educators, hundreds of educators, museum educators, professionals, experts, a lot of people working on this draft, comprehensive draft. In November, an alternative standards draft was presented. And if you were following Twitter, if you were on the news, we saw it was hours and hours of public comment to this alternative draft submitted by the Youngkin administration that was developed very quickly by some consultant. There was pushes for transparency. And then they said, okay, well, I guess we got to hold because of the massive organizing and people saying, And then they said, we'll try to merge the two drafts, the August and the November draft. Well, in December, another group of Virginia Social Studies Leaders Consortium, made up of a lot of people, which has also been endorsed by the Virginia Council for Social Studies and National Council for Social Studies, American Historical Association. They said, okay, well, we'll start the process of making a collaborative draft. And so they started the process and created this December draft. And then about a week and a half ago, the BOE, the Board of Education, they put forth a January draft. So there's a lot of drafts floating around. They are not in conversation, or they're often in conflict with each other. And the idea is that in February 2nd, they're going to decide, I guess, which draft they're going to review and move towards the adoption process. What we still are positioning ourselves as and still saying is that we still need to make sure that those standards in all of the drafts are really doing this real critical work of identifying these tactics of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, but also we see issues around gender equity and equality. Also, there's just a lot of things to work with. But we wanted to set the scene that this is a very politicized context of what's going on in Virginia right now. And we know that this work is more critical, is super critical now more than ever.
And even
that's very much rooted in a lot of these organizations. I would say they're the 1776 curriculum, and that has been something that has undergirded a lot of what is occurring in a lot of these states in response to the 1619 project, which ironically also occurs in Virginia. So yes, I would say it's a big part of, but not the only. There's actually others.
And just to be clear, the standards that we were just sharing examples from with all of the problematic language in there, those were written in 2015, right? During the Black Lives Matter movement, during the Obama era. So we can't just rely on, if once another party gets in, like everything's going to get fixed. This is something that teachers and people that are support allies need to agitate regardless of the political context.
Right. Definitely. The standards work is something that's super ongoing.
And before we jump into this activity, I just want to say, I bet that there among the participants with us right now, that there are already teachers with us who are doing this in school, who are
Right.
decentering the narrative, who are creating those resources, finding those resources, and teaching them to their students, sometimes at great risk to their career. So we just want to give you a shout out and
Yes.
thank you for teaching the truth.
Our teachers that are teaching the truth more and more by the day, those that are you in places that it is consequential, we salute you. And to those of you that are in places where you feel safe to do it, thank you for being in solidarity with those that don't. The resource that I share, it should prompt you to make a copy, but we can also drop it again. Hopefully it'll be able to let you do it. Hold on. But ideally, and then Chris, maybe you could try to drop it in there and see if it'll let you do it.
Sure.
Of course, technology, fun, fun, fun. Also, feel free to maybe use a QR code as well if that works. But what we want you to do once you get access is just take a second to look at some of the US history standards and see how you identify some of the tactics that we talk to of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. What are some ways that we see, maybe it's silos of victimhood, maybe it's the illusion of inclusion, maybe it's avoiding accountability. Oh, yay, it works. Awesome. So we wanted to give you some time to do that. We have a we're on a very tight timeline. So we're going to give you about 3 minutes or 3 or 4 minutes. And we're just going to give you some like independent work time. And then we'll come back together and be prepared to share in the chat.
All right, here we go.
So kind of how we set it up was we wanted to have a reminder of some of the ways we operationalized it. And then we just dropped some standards in today that are currently a part of the 2015 standards that have been in use and currently in use. And then we just wanted you to think about what you noticed and if you were able to identify any tactics of white supremacy or anti-Black racism. Shout out to Michelle, thank you. Shout out Christina, thank you both so much for sharing links that hopefully work. Yes. Thank you for starting to share some examples. So one of the things that we were really seeing that this is very much interconnected to, oh, I love that term, surface diversity. I think that's such a great way to put it. Illusions of inclusion. Let's just put a couple names here. Let's put this. We see the same thing when we think about Asian American experience, extremely limited. And when it's named, it is during a period of oppression. Again, we never get to see the joy, the life that they're actually living and cultivating their own experience. That's never displayed. It's only through periods of oppression, which is a huge disservice to our students. If you're able to access, we hope that you can put maybe a few in the chat that you're seeing. Ooh, you caught one that we also caught around the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act being attributed to LBJ. And we're like, wait, what? It's almost very in line with like in Americans just were doing mass protests. Not even a multiracial mass protest, it really that erasure. What does it do? What does that do?
And we weren't allowed to say this in the paper. I wanted to, Tiff and I would go back and forth. We were surprised with how many like slam dunk lines they let us get away with in the paper, but
You're very
we
spicy.
weren't. What's that?
We were very spicy.
Yeah, we were spicy, but what we weren't able to say, but how we feel is that when we see stuff like the LBJ did the civil rights movement, is like, so have you either not read history books or you have and you know what you're doing, because both are kind of inexcusable and make us really question the people who are writing these standards, what their motivations are. this is not hidden away, some underground history secrets. These are, you know, widely available pieces of
Right.
information.
And that goes back to that who you choose to center and who we need to decenter. Thank you for those who were able to access the text and be able to share some examples. These are exactly the things that we've been seeing, and we hope that this is a practice that you can incorporate, not just in your own practice, but also with your students. So feel free to come off mute or ask a question in the chat. It looks
Yeah,
like
Jessica.
Jessica.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'm not going to put my camera on because I'm a grad student and I didn't feel like getting ready today.
No explanation needed.
So I am a museum educator at George Washington University, and I actually did a project on Virginia's social studies curriculum, or a small presentation on it last semester. And I didn't even think of the things that you guys have been talking about. I think that all your points are very valid, and I am just in awe. And I hope that one day my attitude can be the same as yours in calling out those people who are making the curriculums not so diverse or inclusive. Yeah. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. We really appreciate, that comment, and, we're here in solidarity and in support of that work. We're all on this journey.
All right, Lan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this really helpful presentation. I really enjoyed the rubric that you provided us of how to critique our curriculums. Now I'm at this point where I'm like critiquing my curriculum. I really tried to make it social justice oriented, but of course there's always room for growth, and I'm recognizing some areas of growth for myself. And I wanted to ask you, like, how do we go about avoiding or trying our best to minimize some of these problematic structures that y'all have described? Because I think now we are all pretty well versed in the different ways in which white supremacy and anti-Black racism is embedded in our curriculum. But unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, so many of the resources that are given to us, the textbooks, the curriculum, like that's what it's built upon. How do we go about redesigning our curriculums?
No, that's a great question, because I think we were saying we thought it was more widespread knowledge around it, but we actually said we need to take a step back and do this reckoning piece, because there's so much in the curriculum we're not noticing or identifying, to then be able to think about what we want to create, what we need to disrupt. And so, yes, at that baseline, though, I think we all kind of know the standards are largely problematic, but we really need to reckon with what really is problematic within it, so we don't replicate it in the new materials. And then there's the other piece that you're mentioning, where do we find the curricular resources to do the disruption we want to see? And that requires a lot of pre-work, that requires a lot to do. And there are organizations like Zenet Project, like BLM Curriculum. There's groups like this, DC Area Educators for Social Justice, where we co-construct curriculum together. Like our meetings are around making curriculum. And so I think finding those spaces where we can work in solidarity with each other and then sharing them, because you can find a lot of that on the website, so that others are not starting from scratch, are some of the grassroots ways we have been able to think about and work through. I don't know if you want to add to it, Chris.
One group that has taught me so much is the DC Area Educators for Social Justice as well. The lessons that get shared in there are awesome. And I think you're right, like within an individual school, it can be hard sometimes to find a whole group of people, a cohort of teachers who are both share your content area and your goals with what you're trying to do. So yeah, finding some of those groups that meet virtually can be great.
And each shift is pushing it forward. And I think really engaging young people in honing, because they already come with the critical eye. Honing their critical eye even further allows them to do that work with you, so you're not doing that alone. We really place a lot of value on what our young people already are bringing to the space too. And I know we have, we'll probably take one more quick question. There's a couple great ones in the chat that we want to make sure that we get to, but we do want to give you a few minutes to complete your form, because that's really important. And then while you're doing that, we'll voice over just a couple that were raised in the chat.
We had Emily had a hand
Yes,
raised.
go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I had a question, but we don't have to, it might be like a whole other can of worms. I was mostly just wondering, so I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm actually student teaching right now. And in Charlottesville and Albemarle County, they've switched from like a SOL multiple choice test to this like a performance-based assessment. Where I don't know how widespread this is, but ours is like the IDM, which stands for Inquiry Design
Yes.
Model. And I was just wondering, my impression is that it like could be a space that allows teachers a bit more agency and pushing different narratives and narratives like I want to see centered, but also it's not perfect. So I don't know. I was just wondering if you or anyone has thoughts on that shift and how it might change things, open up space, cause problems. Yeah.
No, definitely. And in DC, we also use the inquiry arc. We use the framing of the C3 framework, IDM. And yes, you're right, especially with the different featured sources, there's an opportunity to curate a more diverse experience. But then there's also an opportunity to replicate a lot of the same issues that we're seeing. So inquiry in that sense is not a perfect model. It really depends on that content curation. Yes, we love Leilani's work. One of my favorite books for her is Lewis and Clark, thinking about the K through 12 experience. Amazing, amazing, amazing. So many critical scholars. We do want to shout out though, there will be some space after this to talk in grade level breakouts. So you will have a chance to get with people that are in the same grade band if you choose to be able to talk and process a bit more. Chris, if you want to put up, our information, we're happy to continue the conversation with you. We know there are lots of questions that have come up about the work that we're doing, but you can catch us on Twitter. We'll also throw our email addresses in the chat if you want to just connect with us and build with us. We're so happy to be in this space with you, but we also want to be respectful of your time. Thank you for, going through this work with us.